The Missouri River was a living thing in the spring of 1849, broad, brown, and swollen with snowmelt from the high country. Its current gnawed at the clay banks and whispered against the cottonwoods like some ancient voice. Along its restless waters, a boy named Thomas Hornaday learned what it meant to be small in a large world. He wasn't born to the wilderness, he was taken by it. His father, a quiet man of Ohio stock, had followed the promise of beaver pelts and trade upriver, and by the time Tom could walk, the boy's cradle was a fur pack, and his lullaby the rhythm of oars slapping water. The frontier had its own form of schooling. The river and the men who worked it were his tutors, men like Charles Larpenteur, the French trader who taught him how to read a man's face as clearly as a map, and old Baptiste Durocher, who could set a broken bone with pine pitch and prayer. In the long winters at Fort Union, when the wind screamed through the chinks in the log walls, the IFK trappers would gather round the fire and trade tales of men who carved the nation with little more than courage and a flintlock. Jedediah Smith, who crossed the Great Basin with nothing but faith and a scar from a grizzly's jaw. Jim Bridger, who spoke the tongue of half the tribes between the Platte and the Yellowstone. Kit Carson, the quiet one, who rode where generals feared to march. Tom listened more than he spoke. He memorized every detail, the routes, the rivers, the words of peace and war in Crow and Blackfoot alike. He came to understand that the wilderness was less a place than a manner of thinking. It didn't forgive noise, haste, or pride. From the Journal of Jedediah S. Smith, one line burned in him like a brand. The path of the just man is beset on every side by peril, yet the just man walks on. Smith had been killed by Comanche in '31, yet his words had crossed decades to reach this boy on the Missouri frontier. To Hornaday, it was less scripture than instruction. Strength without wisdom leads only to ruin. By the time he turned 16, Hornaday could track elk through sleet and mend a canoe split by ice. His world was made of smells, the tallow smoke of the fort's lamps, the sharp tang of wet hides, and the clean, lonely scent of cedar after rain. He had no formal schooling, but he could calculate the worth of a skin bale faster than a trader's clerk. Then came the summer of fever. Steamboats brought cholera upriver, and men fell like wheat before the scythe. Hornaday's parents both took sick and died within a week. He buried them himself on a high bluff overlooking the current they'd followed west. For days he stayed by their graves, listening to the wind slide through prairie grass, wondering what a man became when the last of his kin turned to dust. He found the answer not in sorrow, but in work. He took employment as a runner between posts, carrying dispatches through country still raw with danger. In the years that followed, he became a man of quiet habits. He learned the worth of silence, of patience, of seeing before acting. In 1868, with the nation still raw from the Civil War, Hornaday enlisted as a scout with the U.S. Army. The Indian Wars were sputtering like a dying fire, but the embers still burned across the northern plains. He rode under Colonel Nelson Miles through the Yellowstone campaign and saw the aftermath of battle more than battle itself. Villages burned, ponies scattered, and children searching for the old ones who would never return. It was there that Tom Hornaday began to question what civilization truly meant. He watched Crow intermediaries speak for peace-stoic men whose every gesture carried weight. One of them, Two Whistles, took to the young scout and began teaching him the old ways. From him, Hornaday learned that diplomacy was not talk, but listening. That a man who carried both courage and restraint carried power beyond gunpowder. When a winter column became trapped by blizzard near the Tongue River, it was not the officers who saved the troop, but Hornaday and a pair of Blackfeet trappers who found them half frozen. The trappers, old as the mountains, built shelter from willow and snow, coaxed fire from wet birch, and rationed what little pemmican they had. One night, as the storm howled like a legion of spirits, one of the Blackfeet said something that would remain with Hornaday forever. The land teaches a man how to live. If he listens, he becomes part of it. If he shouts, it throws him out. Hornaday listened. By 1874, his service with the Army ended, and he rode south toward the Powder River country. The land was changing again. Telegraph lines marched west, cattle herds fattened on stolen prairie, and the old fur posts stood like skeletons of another time. The mountain men were fading into memory names carved into cottonwood bark and gravestones. But in Hornaday, the old breed still breathed. He carried the calm that had once steadied Bridger, the quiet faith that had driven Jedediah Smith, and the patience of every trapper who had waited out a long winter in a lonely valley. He worked briefly as a guide for surveyors charting the Big Horn Basin, though he found little joy in helping the East lay claim to the West. He was not made for lines and ledgers. His compass was moral, not magnetic. In the frontier camps, law was often a matter of who drew first. Hornaday had seen too many men die for pride disguised as justice. And so, when the territorial governor of Wyoming came seeking a sheriff, a man not quick to violence but capable of facing it, Hornaday's name came up again and again in the mouths of traders and soldiers alike. He accepted the badge with no ceremony, pinning it to his coat beneath the crow feather 2 whistles had once given him. He said nothing that day, but those who were there remembered his expression a steady calm, as if the weight of iron and the memory of feathers balanced each other perfectly. In time, Sheriff Tom Hornaday would become a figure whispered about from Fort Washakie to the Sweetwater. Not for the number of men he arrested or shot, but for the number of fights that never happened in his presence. He carried his Colt at his side, but it was his eyes that did the work. Men said he could quiet a saloon with a glance and make a drunkard think twice before reaching for his gun. The law, to Hornaday, was not a set of statutes, it was a reflection of balance, the same balance the river kept between flood and drought. And in quiet moments, when the moon hung like a pale coin above the prairie, he would sit by the fire and trace the grain of his rifle stock, thinking not of battles fought, but of the men who had shaped him, Smith, Bridger, Carson, 2 whistles, and all those forgotten teachers who had shown him that a man's first duty was not to conquer the wilderness, but to understand it. For it was in understanding the wild that he learned to understand men. And in mastering both, Tom Hornaday would become something rare in that raw and blood-stained land, a lawman who sought peace before power. By the time Sheriff Tom Hornaday rode into Laramie Crossing, the wind had already worn the paint off the sign. The town huddled in a shallow basin between the Medicine Bow Range and the endless plains, half buried in dust, half built on hope. It was a place that smelled of rawhide, whiskey, and ambition, a temporary camp pretending to be civilization. The railroad hadn't come this far yet, but the promise of it haunted every saloon. Men gambled fortunes on rumors, and gunpowder settled more debts than paper. Hornaday's arrival drew little notice. To the miners and drifters, he looked like another worn piece of the frontier long coat, wide-brimmed hat, boots scuffed by miles of road. His badge caught the sunlight only once, and that was enough. He took the sheriff's office from a predecessor whose courage had, as of all, evaporated sometime between a barroom brawl and a shotgun under the ribs. The desk was scarred by knife points, the jail cells empty but for a broken cot, and the ledger book held more whiskey stains than ink. Hornaday said nothing. He set to work with the same patience he'd learned on the Missouri, quiet, steady, without complaint. He patched the roof himself, repaired the door hinges, and swept the dust out into the street. When he finished, he sat on the porch rail, whittling a piece of cottonwood, watching the town breathe. He saw the pattern immediately. Every boomtown lived the same cycle: greed, lawlessness, and decay. The miners came first, then the merchants, then the gamblers. At last came the women and the preachers, both trying to civilize what God himself seemed content to leave wild. But in Laramie Crossing, something else was brewing, the beginnings of a range war. Cattle had become the new gold. Open land stretched from the Sweetwater to the Powder, and every man with a brand believed he owned the horizon. The biggest of them was Samuel Torrance, a cattle baron with 50 riders under his pay and no patience for fence lines. Torrance's men rode hard, drank harder, and answered to no law but their employer's word. Opposite them were the homesteaders, families who'd come west on borrowed dreams, planting corn where the soil was thin and faith where the rain seldom fell. Between the two sides ran a thin thread of dirt road and bad blood. When Hornaday rode out to introduce himself to Torrance, he found the man leaning against the fence of his sprawling spread, cigar smoke curling through the twilight. "You the new lawman?" Torrance asked, eyes narrow. "I am." "Hope you like hard work. You'll find plenty of it keeping fools from shooting each other over grass." Hornaday studied him a long moment. "Grass doesn't start fights, Mr. Torrance. Men do." Torrance smiled, a slow, unpleasant thing. "Well then, Sheriff, maybe you can stop them." It wasn't a challenge, not exactly. It was a warning. The next weeks tested Hornaday's patience more than the snows of the Yellowstone or the heat of the Dakota Plains ever had. Drunks brawled in the Silver Spur Saloon, miners fought over claims, cowboys rode through town firing pistols at the moon. Each time Hornaday stepped between them, not with bravado, but with presence. He had a way of filling the space, of letting silence hang until a man heard his own foolishness echo back at him. "Go home," he'd say simply. "You've got no quarrel worth dying over." Sometimes they listened, sometimes they didn't, but when they didn't, they learned that the quiet sheriff could move faster than rumor and hit harder than regret. He never boasted, never barked orders. He just was immovable as the granite that held the mountains upright. Before long, even Torrance's riders learned to lower their eyes when Hornaday passed. Despite his success, Hornaday remained uneasy. The town had no roots, only greed holding it together. He often walked the outskirts at dawn, where the sagebrush gave way to rolling grass, and watched the sunlight spill over the land. Out there, he could almost hear the old voices, the trappers, the Crow Scouts, the traders whispering warnings about the cost of taming a land that wasn't meant to be tamed. Sometimes he'd ride north to the Crow Agency, bringing supplies or messages. There he was welcomed with quiet respect. The elders remembered him as the young scout who had once crossed their hunting grounds without arrogance or fear. Chief Long Elk told him once, "You wear the badge of the white man, but you carry the heart of one who listens. Do not let that heart grow hard." Hornaday nodded. "The badge is metal," he said. "It'll rust before I do." The chief smiled. "Then you will last longer than most." But peace, like water in a dry creek bed, never lasts long on the frontier. One August evening, a rider came into town with a crow arrow lodged in his saddlebag and blood on his hands. He claimed he'd been ambushed near the foothills, said the tribes were stirring again, that vengeance was in the air. By dawn, Torrance's men were already gathering their rifles. Hornaday knew the truth before anyone spoke it aloud. It wasn't the crow who had started this. The cattle had been grazing too far north, trespassing on old hunting grounds. Some of Torrance's riders had been drinking, boasting, taking what wasn't theirs. Now the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a spark. The sheriff rode out alone that morning, following the hoofprints toward the hills. He carried no posse, no banners, only the quiet certainty that someone had to stand between two worlds before they destroyed each other. The wind shifted, and in it he could smell smoke not from gunfire yet, but from anger. He reined in, looking east toward the town that was already fading into the haze. Laramie Crossing, a place built on sand and stubbornness, a place that needed a lawman who understood that sometimes peace required more courage than war. He touched the crow feather in his hatband and urged his horse forward into the rising sun. The heat came early that year, dry, crackling, and mean. The grass around Laramie Crossing turned brittle as bone, and tempers dried up with it. The sky itself seemed stretched too thin, all glare and no mercy. It was under that hard sun that Eli Torrance, the cattle baron's youngest son, rode into trouble. Eli was everything his father wasn't, reckless where Samuel Torrance was cold, loud where he was calculating. Folks said the boy had been born angry. He drank like a man trying to drown his own name and gambled like he was owed luck by birthright. One August night his luck ran out. At the Silver Spur, amid the sweat and smoke, Eli took offense at a quiet crow man selling beadwork near the door, a man who had come into town under the white flag of trade. Words were exchanged. twisted by whiskey and pride. Then Eli struck him. The Crow man fell, rose again, and in the motion of self-defense knocked Eli's hat to the floor. The bar froze. No one knows who reached first, but when the noise cleared, the Crow man lay dead, a single shot through his chest. By morning, the news had ridden faster than any courier. The Crow camps north of the Platte were stirring, their lodges alive with grief and fury. Smoke signals rose along the ridge. Laramie Crossing was about to burn. Sheriff Hornaday rode out before the sun crested the horizon. He found Eli Torrance in his father's ranch house, pale and shaken, the revolver still on the table. Samuel Torrance stood behind him, his jaw like cut stone. "My boy defended himself," Torrance said flatly. "That Indian should have known better than to come to town." Hornaday said nothing for a long moment. The light through the window made dust float like ash between them. "Self-defense?" Hornaday asked at last. "There were witnesses who saw a drunk boy start a fight." Torrance's lip curled. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm saying your boy killed a man under treaty protection. That makes it my duty, not yours." The room went still. Then Samuel's voice hardened. "You arrest my son. You'll have more than a mob on your hands, Sheriff. You'll have a war." Hornaday met his stare and didn't blink. "There's already a war waiting outside your door. I'm trying to end it before it starts." He turned, walked out, and left behind two men, one broken by fear, the other by pride. By afternoon, Hornaday was on the trail north. The Crow camps lay along the river's bends, hidden by cottonwood and willow. As he approached, a group of riders appeared, scouts with painted faces and spears tipped in iron. He raised his hand, palm open, and rode forward slowly. The wind carried no sound but the creak of leather and the distant murmur of water. The leader was an older man, Chief Long Elk, whom Hornaday had met years before. Time had bowed his shoulders, but not his dignity. "I thought you had left this country, Sheriff," the chief said. "I tried," Hornaday answered, "but the country won't let me go." Long Elk's eyes were dark as river mud. "Your people killed one of ours, a man of peace." "I know," Hornaday said, "and I'm not here to defend it." He dismounted, unbuckled his gun belt, and laid it on the ground. The scouts watched him with the stillness of wolves. "I came to ask for time," he continued. "Let me take the man who did this. Let the law speak before the rifles do." Long Elk studied him, unmoving. Finally he said, "The law of the Crow is not the law of the white man." "Maybe not," Hornaday said, "but justice ought to speak one language." For a long while no one moved. Then the chief reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew a single crow feather bound with red thread. He placed it in Hornaday's hand. "Take this," he said. "It means we will wait, but not long." Hornaday bowed his head. "You have my word." He rode back under a sky that had turned the color of smoke. The feather trembled in the wind, brushing against his shoulder like a warning. When he reached town, the streets were lined with armed men. Samuel Torrance stood at their head, rifle slung across his arm. "You've been north," Torrance said. "They planning an attack?" "They're planning to bury their dead," Hornaday said evenly. "If you ride on them, you'll give them cause to make it more than one." Torrance spat. "You think a feather and some fancy talk will stop what's coming?" Hornaday looked at him, tired but unflinching. "A feather weighs less than a bullet, but sometimes it carries more peace." Torrance's men laughed harsh, nervous sounds, but the sheriff didn't rise to it. He walked past them, into his office, and began writing a report by lamplight. Every stroke of the pen steady as his heartbeat. Outside, the night grew restless. Horses stamped. Men muttered. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and went silent. The mountains loomed, ancient and impartial, holding their counsel. Hornaday sat alone beneath the lamplight, the feather beside his badge on the desk. One represented law, the other understanding two fragile things in a land built on pride and powder. He knew the days ahead would test which of them was stronger. But for now, the town slept uneasily, unaware that its peace balanced on a promise whispered in a Crow camp, carried south by a man who had learned long ago that sometimes silence could hold back a storm better than steel. The sun had not yet risen when Sheriff Tom Hornaday felt the first tremor of war in the earth. It was faint, the kind of vibration only a man who'd slept years on. Open ground could sense. He stood on the porch of his office, watching as riders moved through the streets of Laramie Crossing, their silhouettes stark against the faint blue of dawn. They weren't ordinary ranch hands anymore. They were a posse summoned by Samuel Torrance to defend the town. In truth, they were a mob looking for redemption through revenge. The rumor had spread like fire. The Crow were gathering north of the river, armed and ready to strike. Hornaday knew better. He'd seen the Crow's camps, seen the morning fires, heard the soft grief in Chief Long Elk's voice. The Crow didn't want war, they wanted justice. But justice and vengeance wore the same face to men like Torrance. He saddled his horse and rode out to meet the cattle baron before the first light touched the peaks. Torrance was waiting near the edge of his property, a dozen armed men at his back. They stood like fence posts in the morning chill, their rifles glinting, their horses restless. "Sheriff," Torrance greeted, his tone flat. "We're riding north. You can come with us, or you can stay out of the way." Hornaday dismounted slowly. "You ride north," he said quietly. "You'll cross a line you can't step back over." Torrance's mustache twitched. "That line was crossed when my boy shot that savage." "Your boy started that fight," Hornaday said, voice even. "And he'll answer for it. But if you take your men into Crow ground, you'll start something none of us can finish." The men behind Torrance shifted uneasily. They'd all heard the stories of Fort Phil Kearny, of Fetterman's men wiped out to the last. The Plains had a memory, and it didn't forgive arrogance. Torrance sneered. "You sound like one of them, Sheriff. Maybe you forgot which side you're on." "I haven't forgotten," Hornaday said. "I just learned there are more sides than yours." For a moment, the only sound was the wind scratching at the dry grass. Then Torrance spurred his horse forward, closing the distance until he was face to face with Hornaday. "Move aside." Hornaday didn't. His eyes, gray as river stone, locked on Torrance's. "Samuel," he said softly, "you've built your name with sweat and fear. Don't end it with fire." Torrance's hand twitched toward his revolver, but the sheriff didn't flinch. The air between them felt heavy, the way it does before lightning. Then, from the ridge behind them, came the sharp crack of a rifle. The bullet kicked dust between their horses. The men scattered, shouting, guns drawn. But Hornaday didn't move. He scanned the ridge, calm as ever. "Hold your fire," he called. That was a warning, not a fight. And he was right. No second shot followed. The hills went still again. That afternoon, Hornaday rode alone to the border of the Crowlands, a stretch of open plain marked only by wagon ruts and a dry creek bed. He stopped there, dismounted, and with the heel of his boot drew a line in the dust. On one side, he placed his badge in the dirt. On the other, he laid the feather Chief Long Elk had given him. "This is the law," he said aloud, "to the wind and the sky. And this is the promise. Neither crosses the other." When the Crow scouts appeared on the ridge, watching him, they saw the gesture and understood. He stood between two worlds, asking neither for surrender, only for patience. By evening, Torrance's riders came into view from the south, dust clouds rising like storm fronts. They halted when they saw the sheriff, a single figure between them and the horizon. Torrance rode forward. "You really think one man can stop 50 rifles?" Hornaday picked up the feather and tucked it into his hatband. "No," he said. "But 50 rifles won't shoot through one lawman unless they're ready to bury their own souls too." The words carried, simple and heavy. The men behind Torrance shifted, uneasy again. They hadn't signed up to shoot a sheriff. Torrance's face darkened. Pride and reason wrestled inside him, and for a long moment it wasn't clear which would win. Then the sky broke open with thunder, a sudden, unexpected storm sweeping down from the mountains. The first drops hit the dust, raising the smell of rain and earth. Torrance swore under his breath, yanking his reins. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Nothing ever is," Hornaday said quietly. The cattlemen turned back toward Laramie Crossing, muttering curses, drowned by the rain. When the last of them was gone, Hornaday stood in the downpour until the line he'd drawn vanished beneath the mud. He picked up his badge, pinned it to his coat, and whispered to the wind, "The mountains can keep their peace tonight." The Crow scouts watched from the ridge, then disappeared into the mist without a word. The storm deepened, washing away tracks, blood, and blame alike. And by morning the world seemed new again, not healed, not innocent, but quiet. For the first time in weeks, there was no smoke on the horizon. The rain lasted 3 days. When it finally passed, the Wyoming sky opened wide and clean again, rinsed of dust and fury. The plains glistened like hammered copper under the sun. For a while, Laramie Crossing seemed to breathe easier. Men came out to mend fences, patch roofs, and pretend the storm had washed away more than just the dirt. But Sheriff Tom Hornaday knew better. Storms never ended anything, they only gave men time to think about what they'd nearly done. He spent those quiet days riding the perimeter between the settlement and the Crow hunting grounds, ensuring no one strayed too far or too proud. Each morning he found the same fragile peace still holding, and each night he thanked the wind for keeping tempers cool. Yet word traveled faster than sense. A rumor had spread through the camps and the saloons alike that the Crow would ride at the next full moon to avenge their fallen brother. The cattlemen swore they'd be ready. The settlers started packing wagons for the road east. The air was thick with waiting. Then came the messenger. A Crow youth, no older than 17, arrived at dusk unarmed, dust-coated, and cautious. He found Hornaday at the edge of town, tending to his horse. "Long Elk sends word," the boy said in broken English. "Come to council, tonight." "Where?" "By the river, the place of willows." Hornaday nodded, cinched his saddle, and rode without another word. He rode alone, as always. The prairie twilight stretched around him, purple and gold. Coyotes barked in the distance, and the smell of wet sage rose from the earth. Ahead, a thin curl of smoke marked the Crow encampment, dozens of tippas standing like pale ghosts against the fading light. The boy led him to the central fire, where elders and warriors sat in a wide circle. Women and children stood beyond, silent and watchful. The fire's glow painted their faces in copper and shadow. At the center sat Chief Long Elk, wrapped in a buffalo robe, his face solemn. Beside him was the Crow widow, her eyes dry now, her sorrow turned to steel. Hornaday removed his hat and stood before them, feeling the heat of the flames lick at his boots. Long Elk spoke first. "We have waited, as you asked, but the man who killed our brother still breathes. His people drink and laugh. There is no justice." Hornaday nodded slowly. "There will be. I gave my word." "Your word is strong," said Long Elk, "but your people's word is wind." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the circle. Hornaday looked around the ring of faces, his voice low but carrying. "I can't change what's been done, but I can make certain it does not happen again. Give me the man. Let him stand trial before my people. If he's guilty, he'll hang." One of the elders spat into the dirt. "You hang your own when they steal horses. You hang our Develos, sons, for breathing your air." The words stung because they were true. Hornaday met the man's gaze. "Maybe so, but the only way I know to build peace is to start with one promise kept. You've kept yours. Now let me keep mine." Silence. The fire cracked. Sparks drifted up like lost prayers. Finally, Long Elk rose. His height still carried command, though age had bent him some. He studied Hornaday as if weighing the last of his faith. "You say you will bring justice," he said, "but your law serves your own." "It serves the land," Hornaday said, "and the land is watching us both." The old chief's eyes softened, just enough for memory to flicker there. "You speak like a man who once listened to rivers." "I will listen again one more night." He reached into the firelight and withdrew something from the pouch at his side, a strip of calfskin marked with symbols and ink. "This was written when our fathers traded peace for time. The white men called it a treaty. We called it a lie that came true. Tonight we will write another, Not for our fathers, but for our sons." He gestured for Hornaday to sit. A buffalo skull was brought to serve as a table. Ink and quills were laid beside it. Hornaday hesitated. "If I write this, Chief, I can't promise my governor will honor it." Long Elk's mouth curved in the faintest of smiles. "Then we will honor it for him." The night grew deep. Coyotes sang from the hills. Around the council fire, words were traded in low tones, measured and deliberate. Hornaday wrote each agreement carefully, his hand steady despite the weight of what he knew he was doing, forging peace without permission, swearing an oath neither side could fully uphold. Yet the act itself carried meaning. The agreement was simple. The Crow would withdraw north of the river. The ranchers would keep their herds south. The young man's death would be investigated under territorial law. No man would cross armed into the other's land. When the writing was done, Hornaday signed first, his name small beneath the larger, looping script of Long Elk. Then each elder pressed a thumbprint beside it, red ochre against calfskin. The widow stepped forward last. She took a coal from the fire and touched it lightly to the page, leaving a black mark above her husband's name. "So he will not be forgotten," she said. Hornaday bowed his head. "Nor will he be." They sealed the treaty with silence. The fire burned low, and the stars opened above a river of light flowing across the dark. When Hornaday finally rose to leave, Long Elk placed a hand on his arm. "The paper will not stop bullets," he said. "No," Hornaday answered. "But maybe it'll stop the hands that hold them." The chief nodded once. "You are a man between worlds. Be careful not to fall into either." Hornaday smiled faintly. "That's the only way a man can walk straight." He rode back toward Laramie. Crossing under the moon, the calfskin treaty rolled tight in his saddlebag. Behind him, the crow fires flickered out one by one until the prairie was dark again. At the edge of the river, he paused. The current shimmered, carrying moonlight like silver dust. He thought of all the treaties the land had swallowed before this one, and all the promises broken to bone and blood. But still, he whispered into the night, "Let this one hold." And for a fleeting moment, with the stars glinting on the water and the wind quiet as breath, it felt like the earth itself was listening. When Sheriff Tom Hornaday rode back into Laramie Crossing at dawn, he looked as though he had been riding through centuries, not miles. The treaty was folded in oilskin, tied behind his saddle, and the crow feather still rode the brim of his hat. The town was just waking, a blacksmith's hammer echoing, a dog barking somewhere near the freight yard, the smell of coffee and coal smoke drifting down Main Street. He dismounted before the jailhouse and stood a long while in the pale light, staring at the badge pinned to his coat. It gleamed faintly, but he knew what it truly was. Not authority, but burden. Inside, the office was as he'd left it, maps on the wall, rifles in the rack, and a half-burned lamp still warm from the night before. Eli Torrance sat behind bars now, head bowed, hands trembling. Hornaday had arrested him quietly at sunrise, without violence, without witnesses. The boy hadn't protested. He looked like a man who had already seen the ghost of what he'd done. "My father'll kill you for this," Eli had whispered when the cuffs went on. Hornaday had only said, "Maybe, but it won't bring anyone back." By noon, word of the arrest had spread through every saloon, boarding house, and livery stable. The town hummed with talk. Some called Hornaday a hero, others a fool. To most of the cattlemen, he was something worse, a traitor. When Samuel Torrance arrived, he didn't bother knocking. He stormed through the door, boots thudding like gunfire, and slammed his fist onto the desk hard enough to rattle the inkwell. "You've gone too far this time, Sheriff." Hornaday didn't rise from his chair. "The law says a man who kills must stand trial." "The law?" Torrance spat. "You think the law means anything out here? You think those savages will let you walk free once they see the boy hang?" Hornaday looked up at him, his expression calm. "They'll see justice done. That's all they asked." Torrance leaned forward, his face red, his voice lowering to a growl. "You're siding with them over your own kind. I'm siding with what's right." There was a long silence. Torrance's hand twitched near his holster, then stopped. He looked into Hornaday's eyes and saw something there, not fear, not defiance, but conviction. It made him hesitate, and that hesitation saved them both. "You won't last here," he muttered. "The men won't follow a sheriff who'd trade a white boy's neck for an Indian's peace." Hornaday's gaze didn't waver. "Then they'll follow someone who can bury them all." That night, Hornaday sat alone, reading by lamplight. The treaty lay open beside him, its edges curling in the dry air. He traced the red ochre thumbprints with one calloused finger, each a promise, each a risk. He thought of James Beckwourth, who had lived as both Crow and white man, never belonging fully to either. Beckwourth had once written that peace between two worlds costs a man his place in both. Hornaday understood that now. He was becoming a stranger in his own town. Even the merchants who had once nodded politely now crossed the street when he passed. The preacher spoke from the pulpit about men who served two masters. The gamblers watched him with wary eyes. Only the children still greeted him, waving as he rode by, too young to see how quickly righteousness turns to exile on the frontier. But there were others who stood with him quietly, the storekeeper's wife who left bread at his door, the miner who tipped his hat in passing, the schoolteacher who said softly, "You did right, Sheriff, even if no one thanks you for it." Those small kindnesses kept him steady. When the trial came, it was held in the half-finished courthouse, still smelling of pine. The judge rode in from Cheyenne, and the townsfolk packed every bench, hungry for spectacle. Eli Torrance looked hollow, worn thin by guilt and sleepless nights. He confessed before the jury could even be seated, saying, "I was drunk, and I shot a man who never raised his hand against me." The verdict was guilty. The sentence, hanging. Outside, the crowd broke into two camps, half calling for blood, half calling for mercy. Samuel Torrance rode away before the sentence was spoken, his face as white as the clouds over the peaks. Hornaday watched it all in silence, his hat in his hands. When it was over, he didn't celebrate, didn't drink, didn't speak. He just walked to the river that night and sat on the bank until the stars came out. He imagined Long Elk somewhere beyond those same stars, keeping his people from war because one man's promise had been kept. He hoped it was enough. Weeks passed. The Crow camps withdrew north of the river, as agreed. The ranchers stopped sending riders across the boundary. Laramie Crossing quieted again, a brittle, uneasy peace, but peace nonetheless. Still, Hornaday knew the cost. The cattlemen refused to do business with him. His pay was cut. The territorial office sent letters questioning his judgment in delicate Indian matters. He burned those letters in his stove without reading them twice. One evening, as autumn rolled down from the mountains, a group of Crow scouts rode into town. They carried no weapons, only gifts, a cured elk hide, a carved pipe, and a folded note bearing Long Elk's mark. It read, simply, "You kept your word. The rivers remember." Hornaday smiled at that. He set the feather and the letter side by side on his desk, symbols of a fragile balance he had sworn to protect. He thought about resigning, about disappearing into the wilderness, again a nameless man among the pines, where the only law was survival. But something in him wouldn't allow it. The mountains had taught him endurance, and now the plains demanded it. So he stayed. Every morning he put on the badge that half the town hated and all the land respected. Every night he walked the quiet streets, listening to the wind whistle through the telegraph wires like some old, unending song. He understood then what the mountain men had always known, that a man could live a whole life between two worlds and belong to neither, yet still leave both a little better than he found them. And so, when dawn came again over the wide Missouri country, Sheriff Tom Hornaday saddled his horse and rode out to the ridge, where he could see both the ranches and the Crow lands beyond. The sun broke the horizon, gold and new. He touched the feather in his hat and whispered to the wind, "Let peace ride a little longer." The wind carried it north. The winter came early that year. It rolled down from the high country in great gray waves, swallowing the plains and quieting the noise of men. Snow crept into every crack of Laramie Crossing, frosting the windows and blanketing the ruts of the stage road until the town looked like it had been carved out of bone. Sheriff Tom Hornaday didn't mind the cold. He'd spent too many winters under open sky to fear frost. But the silence it brought, that was another matter. The kind of silence that made a man hear his own doubts too clearly. The range war that never was had faded into story. The Crow had kept to their side of the river. The ranchers grudgingly kept to theirs. The town went on, scarred but breathing. Yet the sheriff could feel something, shifting beneath that quiet, the way ice groans before it cracks. Every piece has its price. He knew that. He'd paid it in full. Eli Torrance's hanging had been swift and clean. The boy had faced it with a strange calm, perhaps the first moment of manhood in his short life. His father, Samuel, hadn't been there. He'd sold his herd and ridden south the next day, leaving behind only an empty ranch and the echo of his name. Some said he went to Texas. Others swore they saw him in Cheyenne, drunk and broken. Hornaday didn't ask. He'd learned not to chase ghosts. After that, the town's respect for Hornaday curdled into something harder to name. They didn't despise him, not openly, but they no longer met his eyes. His authority held, yet his welcome had vanished. He began to understand what old Beckworth had meant about the loneliness of men who stand between worlds. When a man keeps peace long enough, both sides start wondering whose peace it truly is. Still, he did his duty. He patrolled the frozen streets, checked the telegraph office, kept the jail warm for the drunks who couldn't make it home. He never drew his gun, never raised his voice. The land didn't need more noise. It needed steadiness. But sometimes, as he sat by the stove at night, he'd glance at the wall where two things hung side by side, his badge and the crow feather. One gleamed faintly in the firelight, the other drifted at the slightest draft. They looked like they belonged to different worlds entirely. And maybe they did. The last day of his lawman's life began like any other. He was cleaning his rifle when the telegraph operator came running down the boardwalk, waving a slip of paper like it was aflame. "Sheriff, wire from Cheyenne." Hornaday took it, read it twice, then folded it carefully. "What's it say?" the operator asked. Hornaday's face gave nothing away. "Says they're sending a replacement." The man blinked. "You mean?" "I mean I'm done." He stood, hung the rifle back on the wall, and looked around the office, the cracked window pane, the stove scarred with boot marks, the logbook half filled with names of men, now dust. A life measured not in victories, but in things prevented. He took off his badge and placed it on the desk. It left a small circle of clean wood beneath it, surrounded by years of grime, a faint outline of service. Then he reached for the crow feather and slid it into the brim of his hat. The operator, still standing in the doorway, asked softly, "What'll you do now, Sheriff?" Hornaday smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I reckon I'll go where I can hear the wind again." He rode out at dusk, the sky bruised with snow clouds. The town's lamps flickered behind him like fading campfires. He didn't look back. A man who lives by the mountains learns early that farewell is just another word for distance. His horse's hooves made soft prints. In the drifts, as he followed the frozen river north, the stars came out one by one, sharp as sparks. Somewhere far ahead, beyond the pale hills, lay Crow Country land he'd once sworn to keep in balance. He found the camp of Long Elk 3 days later. The chief was older now, shoulders stooped, hair silvered like the river ice. Yet when he saw the sheriff ride in, a smile ghosted across his weathered face. "You kept your word," he said in Crow tongue. "The rivers still run clear." Hornaday dismounted, stiff from the cold. "For now," he said. "But men have a way of muddying water." Long Elk laughed quietly. "And yet you still ride to clean it." They sat together by the fire that night, two men of different nations bound by the same weariness. The chief spoke of seasons and omens. Hornaday spoke of silence and endings. When the embers burned low, Long Elk handed him a small pouch. Inside was a length of rawhide, wrapped around the calfskin treaty they had, written years before. "It belongs to you now," the chief said. "Our sons will not remember the words, only that two men once spoke them." Hornaday nodded, his voice low. "That's enough." He slept under the stars that night, the treaty beside his saddle, the feather still tucked in his hat. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, whispering like old friends speaking of things long past. At dawn, he said his goodbyes. Long Elk raised his hand in blessing. "You will not be remembered in songs," he said, "but the land remembers quiet men." Hornaday smiled. "That's all I ever asked." He turned his horse south, riding slow, the plains opening before him like a sea of gold beneath the morning sun. He didn't know where he was headed, maybe back toward the Missouri, maybe to the mountains where the fur posts still stood as ruins. Some say he built a cabin near the Wind River and lived out his days trapping and tending to lost travelers. Others claim he vanished altogether, leaving only his horse tied by a stream and his badge buried in the dust. But years later, when a party of surveyors crossed the northern plains, they found a small leather pouch in an abandoned shelter inside it, a tarnished sheriff's star, and a crow feather bound together by sinew. Pinned to the wall above it was a single line carved in rough, deliberate letters. "Peace is the quiet between storms. Keep it if you can." They took it to the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, where it still hangs behind glass, unproven, unnamed, but powerful in its simplicity. And every spring, when the snow melts from the high passes and the rivers swell with new life, the wind carries a faint whisper across the valley, the kind that sounds, if a man listens close enough, like hoofbeats, fading into silence, the kind that belongs to a man who once ended a war without firing a shot. The feather and the badge, the law and the promise, the man and the mountain. Tom Hornaday rode between them all, and belonged finally to none but the wind.